Billionaire invites black janitor's son to play chess as a joke. He didn't know he was a child genius. A billionaire in a glass tower. A janitor's son with nothing but a mop bucket and a quiet stare. When the billionaire invites him to a chess match as a joke, no one expected this. But by the time the first piece moved, the game had already been lost. What happens next will leave you stunned. Hey, story lover! Welcome to the Narrative Hub, Reddit Stories. Believe me, this adventure gets wild, but it's only epic with you. Seriously, you make this possible. Want more stories? Greater adventure? Smash subscribe right now. Smash like. Comment below. Let's go. The 47th floor of Cummings Tech Industries hummed with the kind of quiet power that only billions of dollars could buy. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city below, where tiny people scurried like ants through their meaningless lives. In the center of this glass cathedral sat Presley Cummings himself, tech mogul, venture capitalist, and, according to Forbes, the 23rd richest man in America. But tonight wasn't about business. Tonight was about entertainment. Gentlemen, Presley announced to his 8 guests, each worth at least 9 figures, I have something special planned for dessert. The private dining room fell silent except for the soft clink of crystal glasses. These weren't just wealthy men, they were titans of industry, senators, media moguls. Men who could reshape economies with a phone call. And they were all looking at Presley with the hungry eyes of predators who smelled fresh blood. You see, Presley continued, his voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that only came from never facing consequences, I've been watching our night janitor's boy. 12 years old, quiet as a mouse, always carrying around this beaten-up chess book. Senator Richardson, whose political campaigns Presley funded, leaned forward with interest. Where are you going with this, Presley? I thought we might invite him up. Give him a little chess lesson. Presley's smile was shark-like. Show him how the real world works. The laughter that erupted was sharp and bitter. These men understood power, and they understood humiliation. The idea of watching a poor black child get crushed by their host wasn't just entertainment, it was a reminder of the natural order of things. A lesson in knowing one's place. Brilliant, chuckled media baron Jonathan Vex, already imagining how he might spin this into content. The boy won't know what hit him. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that 3 floors below, David Williams was finishing his final preparation. At 12 years old, he had already memorized every major chess opening, studied every grandmaster game from the past century, and solved tactical puzzles that would challenge international masters. But David wasn't just gifted. He was something far more dangerous. He was underestimated. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt like ascending to another planet. David had been in this building countless times, but always at night, always in the shadows, always invisible. His father, Jerome Williams, had worked the night shift as a janitor for Cummings Tech for 8 years, long enough to know that rich people weren't usually generous without wanting something in return. Remember what I taught you, Jerome whispered as they approached the executive dining room. Keep your head up, speak when spoken to, and be respectful. These are different kinds of people. David nodded, clutching his worn copy of My System by Aaron Nimzowitsch. The book was held together by tape and had been his constant companion for the past 2 years. Every page was marked with notes in his careful handwriting, improvements on grandmaster games, tactical variations, endgame studies that he'd solved in his head during math class. The dining room doors opened, and David stepped into a world that might as well have been on Mars. The chandelier above probably cost more than his family made in 5 years. The men around the table wore watches that could have paid for his college education. And at the head of the table sat Presley Cummings, studying David like a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Ah, there's our young champion," Presley announced, his voice booming with false warmth. "David, isn't it? Your father tells me you're quite the chess enthusiast." The other men turned to look at David with expressions ranging from amusement to barely concealed contempt. Senator Richardson actually chuckled under his breath. Media mogul Vex was already recording with his phone, sensing content gold. "Yes, sir," David replied quietly, his voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere. "I enjoy the game." "Enjoy it." Presley slapped the table in mock delight. "Gentlemen, he enjoys it." "Well, David, as it happens, I have a beautiful chess set right here. Carved from Italian marble, each piece worth more than, well, considerably more than your father makes in a month." The laughter was sharper now, crueler. These men weren't just rich, they were predators who fed on humiliation. And David was supposed to be tonight's meal. "Now, I'll make you a deal," Presley continued, his eyes glittering with malicious joy. "You play me one game. Just one. If you can last 15 minutes without me checkmating you, I'll give your father a bonus of $10,000. The room went silent. $10,000 was more money than the Williams family had ever seen at once. Jerome's eyes widened. That money could change everything for them. "And if I lose before 15 minutes? David asked, his young voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Presley's grin widened. "Then your father finds a new job. Tonight." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. These men weren't just rich, they were monsters. They were about to destroy a family for their own amusement, and they couldn't have been happier about it. But what Presley Cummings didn't know, what none of them knew, was that David Williams had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Not this specific moment, but the kind of moment where everything was on the line and only pure skill could save the day. "I accept," David said quietly, setting his book down on the table. The game was about to begin. The chess set was indeed magnificent, hand-carved marble pieces, each one a work of art. The board itself was made from alternating squares of black and white marble, polished to a mirror finish. Under the chandelier's light, it looked like a battlefield fit for gods. Presley made a show of setting up the pieces, his movements theatrical and condescending. "Now, David, do you know how the pieces move? The little horsey here goes in an L shape and the castle." "I know how they move," David interrupted softly, and something in his tone made Presley pause. For just a moment, the boy's eyes had flashed with something that looked almost like predatory intelligence. But that was impossible. This was a janitor's kid, probably never even played on a Real board before. "Of course you do," Presley recovered, his tone returning to its patronizing warmth. "Well then, shall we begin? You can have white first move advantage and all that." David sat across from Presley, his small frame dwarfed by the massive leather chair. Around them, the billionaires settled in to watch the slaughter. Phones were out, recording what they assumed would be a quick and amusing demolition of a child's dreams. But as David reached for his king's pawn, something strange happened. The nervous energy in his body seemed to drain away, replaced by an almost supernatural calm. His hand, which had been slightly trembling moments before, became perfectly steady. He moved his pawn to e4, the king's pawn opening, the most classical start in all of chess. Presley nodded approvingly. A classic choice. Very textbook." He responded with e5, mirroring David's move. "You know, I learned this opening when I was at Harvard. My chess instructor there said." David's next move cut him off mid-sentence. "NF3, the Italian game setup." But it wasn't just the move that was impressive, it was the speed. No hesitation, no deliberation. As if David had already seen this exact position 1,000 times before. Which, in fact, he had. Presley frowned slightly, but continued his own development with NC6. The pattern was familiar, comfortable. He'd played the Italian game dozens of times in college, always with success against weaker opponents. But David's response made his blood run cold. BC4. The move came so fast it was almost violent. And suddenly, Presley realized that this wasn't going to be the easy crushing he'd expected. The boy wasn't just playing moves, he was building something. Something dangerous. Around the table, the spectators began to sense that something wasn't quite right. The easy laughter had died down. Senator Richardson leaned forward, his political instincts telling him that the narrative was beginning to shift. "Interesting choice," Presley said, trying to maintain his confidence. But his voice had lost some of its swagger. He castled kingside, a safe, solid move. David's response was immediate, D3. It was a quiet move, almost unnoticeable. But to anyone who truly understood chess, it was terrifying. Because that small pawn move had just set up a tactical trap so sophisticated, so perfectly concealed, that even a master might miss it. Presley studied the board more carefully now. Something was wrong. The position looked innocent enough, but there was a tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm. His next move, F5, seemed natural, attacking David's bishop, forcing it to retreat. David didn't retreat the bishop. Instead, he played Ing5. And suddenly, Presley Cummings, worth $2.6 billion, graduate of Harvard Business School, destroyer of smaller companies, realized that he was in mortal danger. The knight on G5 wasn't just attacking a pawn. It was the centerpiece of a combination so brutal, so perfectly calculated, that Presley's mouth went dry just looking at it. If he took the knight, David's bishop would deliver checkmate in 3 moves. If he ignored it, the knight would destroy his entire position. For the first time in 20 years, Presley Cummings was experiencing pure, unadulterated fear. "Your move," David said quietly, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Something cold. Something that sounded almost like hunger. The silence in the room was deafening. What had started as casual entertainment for 8 of the world's most powerful men had suddenly become something else entirely, a public execution, with Presley Cummings as the condemned man. Presley stared at the board, his mind racing through possibilities. Every variation he calculated ended the same way: total annihilation. The boy, this 12-year-old son of a janitor, had constructed a tactical masterpiece so perfect, so devastating, that escape was literally impossible. "Take your time," David said, his voice still soft, but now carrying an undertone that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "Chess is a game that rewards patience." Media mogul Jonathan Vex had stopped recording. This wasn't funny anymore. Senator Richardson had gone pale, recognizing that his patron, the man who funded his political career, was being systematically destroyed by a child. The other billionaires shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly realizing that they were witnessing something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Presley tried to maintain his composure. "Clever little trap," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "But I've seen this pattern before." It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Presley had never seen anything like this, because combinations of this complexity didn't come from chess books. They came from the minds of genuine prodigies. And sitting across from him, perfectly calm, perfectly patient, was something he had never encountered before, an intellect that dwarfed his own. Presley finally made his move on F6, trying to block David's attack. It was the best defense available, but it was like trying to stop a tsunami with a paper dam. David's response was instantaneous: BXF7 check. The bishop's sacrifice hit the board like a gunshot. King takes bishop was forced, there was no choice. And as Presley reluctantly captured the piece, David's face broke into the first smile anyone had seen from him all evening. It wasn't a nice smile. Ing5+, David announced, and his knight delivered a fork so savage that Presley actually recoiled from the board. The knight was simultaneously attacking Presley's king and queen. No matter where the king moved, the queen would be captured. In one combination, David had won Presley's most powerful piece and shattered his entire position. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that David had calculated this entire sequence before he'd even sat down. While Presley had been making jokes about horsey pieces and castle pieces, David had been setting up a tactical sequence that would have impressed Mikhail Tal himself. "You know," David said conversationally as Presley moved his king to safety, "I've been studying your games." Presley froze. "My games?" From Harvard. "Your chess club records are online." David captured the queen with casual precision. "You like the Italian game, but you always play f5 too early. It creates weaknesses." The blood drained from Presley's face. This wasn't just a chess game anymore, it was a character assassination. The boy had studied him, prepared for him, set a trap specifically designed to exploit his weaknesses. Around the table, the spectators were beginning to understand what they were really watching. This wasn't David getting lucky. This was a predator that had been lying in wait, and Presley Cummings had walked directly into its jaws. "How?" Presley whispered, his voice barely audible. David's smile widened. "How what, Mr. Cummings? How did you know?" For the first time, David looked up from the board and made direct eye contact with Presley. What the billionaire saw in those young eyes made his soul shrivel. "I know everything about this game," David said simply. "And I know everything about you." Senator Richardson cleared his throat, trying to break the suffocating tension. "Presley, perhaps we should." "No." The word came from David, sharp and final. Every adult in the room turned to stare at the 12-year-old boy who had just given a United States senator an order. "The game isn't finished," David continued, his eyes never leaving Presley's face. "And I believe we had an agreement about 15 minutes. Presley glanced at the ornate clock on the wall. 7 minutes had passed. 7 minutes, and his position was already in ruins. His king was exposed, his queen was gone, and David's pieces were swarming like angry wasps. "David," Jerome Williams finally spoke up, his voice tight with worry. "Maybe that's enough." "Dad." David's voice was gentle when he addressed his father, completely different from the cold precision he'd used with everyone else. "Trust me." Jerome fell silent. In that moment, he realized that his son had become something he didn't recognize. The quiet boy who helped him with building maintenance, who read chess books by flashlight after bedtime, had transformed into something that frankly terrified him. Presley made another move, a desperate attempt to trade pieces and simplify the position. But David's response was so fast, so perfectly calculated, that it seemed almost mechanical. "You want to know how I knew?" David asked as he developed another piece with surgical precision. "You want to know how a janitor's son could see through your little game?" Presley nodded mutely, no longer able to speak. "I've been watching you for 2 years, David said matter-of-factly. "Every night when Dad cleans your office, I study the awards on your wall. Harvard Chess Club champion, 1997. Your old tournament records, your playing style, your weaknesses. You never noticed me, but I was always there." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You think being rich makes you smart," David continued, his pieces flowing across the board like water. "You think having money means you understand how the world works. But you don't understand anything." Presley tried to mount a counterattack, but every move he made only worsened his position. It was like fighting quicksand. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. "You want to know what real intelligence looks like?" David asked, and for the first time, there was emotion in his voice. "Anger. It's not having enough money to buy Harvard. It's not having connections that get you government contracts." David's rook slammed down on the 7th rank, and suddenly Presley's entire kingside was collapsing. Real intelligence is a 12-year-old boy who teaches himself chess from library books while his father works 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Real intelligence is solving grandmaster-level puzzles in your head because you can't afford a computer. Real intelligence is seeing 20 moves ahead while you can barely see one. The words hit Presley like physical blows. Around the table, The other billionaires were beginning to understand that they weren't just watching a chess game, they were watching a reckoning. "Check," David announced softly. Presley's king was trapped, surrounded by David's pieces like wolves circling a wounded deer. Every escape square was covered. Every defensive resource was exhausted. And there were still 4 minutes left on the clock. Presley stared at the board in numb horror. Check. Not checkmate yet, but something far worse: slow, methodical torture. David wasn't going for the quick kill. He was savoring this. "You know what's funny?" David said, his voice returning to that conversational tone that somehow made everything more terrifying. "I actually felt sorry for you when this started." Presley moved his king to the only available square, buying himself perhaps 2 more moves before the inevitable. "Sorry for me?" Presley croaked. "You have everything," David continued, pursuing the king with relentless precision. "Money, power, respect. And you're still so small. So desperate to prove you're better than everyone else that you'd humiliate a child for entertainment." The clock showed 12 minutes elapsed. David had been systematically dismantling not just Presley's position, but his entire worldview, and they still had 3 minutes of contracted torture remaining. "But I understand now," David said, his next move tightening the noose around Presley's king. "You're not evil. You're just pathetic." Media mogul Vex had completely stopped recording. This was beyond content now. This was a public psychological dissection that no one wanted preserved for posterity. "My father," David continued, "works 16-hour days to pay for our apartment. He's never once complained, never once made excuses, never once blamed anyone else for his situation. He's twice the man you'll ever be, and he makes in a year what you spend on lunch." Presley tried desperately to create some counterplay, but David's position was so overwhelming that every move just accelerated the inevitable. "Check," David announced again. This time, Presley's king had only one escape square. The net was tightening. "You invited me here to humiliate me," David said. "To show your friends how natural selection works. To remind everyone about the proper order of things." David's pieces moved with mechanical precision, each one perfectly placed, perfectly coordinated. "But natural selection doesn't care about your bank account, Mr. Cummings. It cares about intelligence, adaptability, the ability to see patterns that others miss." The clock showed 14 minutes, 1 minute remaining in their agreement. "And by those standards," David said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, "you're already extinct." The final move came like a sword falling. David's queen, supported by 2 rooks and a knight, slid across the board to deliver the killing blow. Checkmate. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Presley stared at the board, his mind unable to process what had just happened. 14 minutes and 37 seconds. The boy had given him an extra 20 seconds of life, and even that had felt like mercy. Around the table, 8 of the world's most powerful men sat in stunned silence. They had just witnessed something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives: the complete intellectual destruction of one of their own by a child they had dismissed as worthless. But David wasn't finished. "Interesting position," said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see an elderly black woman entering the dining room. She was perhaps 70 years old, impeccably dressed, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and something that might have been amusement. "Grandmother." David's face lit up with the first genuine joy anyone had seen from him all evening. "Hello, baby," she said, walking over to examine the chessboard. "I see you've been playing with your food again." Presley found his voice. "I'm sorry, but this is a private." "Dr. Evelyn Hayes," she interrupted, extending a hand that Presley took automatically. "Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at MIT, former chess champion of Massachusetts, and David's chess teacher for the past 6 years." The room went completely silent. "You're His teacher? Senator Richardson managed. Oh, much more than that, Dr. Hayes smiled. I'm also his great-grandmother. And, as it happens, the former strategic advisor for 3 Fortune 500 companies and 2 presidential campaigns. She gestured to the chessboard. David, dear, this was the Ing-5 gambit we worked on last summer, wasn't it? Yes, ma'am, David replied, his earlier coldness completely gone. Though I modified the seventh move based on your suggestion about early queen development. Presley's world was spinning. You planned this? Dr. Hayes looked genuinely surprised. Planned what? A chess game? Mr. Cummings, David plays chess the way most children breathe, constantly and without thinking about it. What exactly did you think would happen when you challenged a boy who's been playing Grandmaster level chess since he was 8 years old? Grandmaster level? Media mogul Vex whispered. Oh my, yes, Dr. Hayes said cheerfully. David has a USCF rating of 2,347, which makes him approximately the 40th ranked chess player in the United States. For his age, he's the strongest player in American history. The implications hit the room like a tidal wave. They hadn't just witnessed an upset, they had watched a world-class chess player toy with an amateur. It was like watching a professional boxer spar with a toddler. But how? Presley stammered. How is a janitor's son a chess prodigy? Dr. Hayes asked. The same way anyone becomes exceptional at anything, Mr. Cummings. Talent, hard work, and proper instruction. She moved to stand behind David, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Jerome is my grandson, she continued. Harvard MBA, actually. Worked on Wall Street for 15 years before the 2008 crash wiped out his firm. He took the custodial job here because it was the only work he could find that offered health insurance for his family. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Jerome Williams, the man they had all dismissed as just a janitor, was more qualified than half the people in this room. As for David, Dr. Hayes continued, he's been accepted to MIT's early admission program. Full scholarship, naturally. He starts next fall. Presley felt like he was drowning. Every assumption, every prejudice, every comfortable belief about social hierarchy was crashing down around him. So you see, Dr. Hayes said, her voice taking on an edge that reminded everyone exactly where David had learned his psychological warfare skills, when you invited my great-grandson to play chess as a joke. You were essentially challenging Bobby Fischer to a game of checkers. She paused, letting the humiliation sink in completely. The only joke here, Mr. Cummings, was the idea that money could substitute for intelligence. The silence that followed Dr. Hayes's words was so complete that the distant hum of the building's ventilation system sounded like a roar. 8 billionaires, men who controlled governments and shaped global markets, sat like chastened schoolchildren in the presence of a mathematics professor and a 12-year-old boy. Presley Cummings, his face the color of ash, finally managed to speak. The $10,000. Keep it, David interrupted quietly. We don't need your money. The rejection hit Presley harder than any insult could have. Not only had he been intellectually destroyed, but now even his wealth, his primary source of power and identity, was being dismissed as irrelevant. David received a full scholarship to MIT worth $280,000, Dr. Hayes explained. He's also been offered consulting contracts with 3 major tech companies for algorithm development. At 12 years old, his earning potential already exceeds that of everyone in this room. Senator Richardson shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps we should all just. Oh, but we're not finished, Dr. Hayes said, her tone suddenly sharp as a blade. You see, gentlemen, I'm not just here as David's teacher. I'm here as a concerned citizen who's very interested in how tax dollars are spent. She pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through documents. Senator Richardson, you've received $2.3 million in campaign contributions from Cummings Tech over the past 5 years. In return, you voted to approve 17 government contracts totaling $847 million in taxpayer money for Mr. Cummings's companies. Richardson's face went white. That's perfectly legal. Oh, absolutely, Dr. Hayes agreed. Though I'm sure the voters in your district would be fascinated to learn how enthusiastically you support corporate welfare while voting to cut education funding. She turned to media mogul Vex. Mr. Vex, your news network has been running a series about welfare queens and the need for personal responsibility in poor communities. I'm curious how you reconcile that with the $340 million in federal subsidies your media conglomerate received last year. Vex said nothing, but his jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like cables. The truth is, Dr. Hayes continued, every person in this room has benefited from affirmative action your entire lives. Legacy admissions, family connections, inherited wealth, government contracts handed out based on who you know rather than what you can do. You're the real welfare recipients. You've just convinced yourselves that you earned what was given to you. David watched his great-grandmother with obvious admiration. This was where he had learned his tactical brilliance, not just in chess, but in life. My great-grandson, Dr. Hayes said, has earned everything he's achieved through pure merit. No family connections, no inherited advantages, no systems rigged in his favor. He's accomplished more by age 12 than most people manage in a lifetime, and he's done it despite every obstacle you and people like you have put in his way. She closed the tablet with a sharp click. So when you invited him here to humiliate him for your entertainment, you weren't just attacking a child. You were attacking the very concept of merit itself. You were proving that no matter how brilliant, how hardworking, how deserving someone might be, you believe they should stay in their place. Presley finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What do you want? Dr. Hayes smiled, and it was not a kind expression. Justice, Mr. Cummings. Simple justice. You see, Dr. Hayes continued, her voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture, David's chess rating puts him in the top 0.01% of players worldwide. His IQ test results, administered by MIT, place him in the top 0.001% of the global population. By any objective measure, he is quite literally one of the most intellectually gifted individuals on the planet. She walked slowly around the table, making eye contact with each billionaire in turn. And yet, when you looked at him tonight, what did you see? A joke. A prop. A disposable child whose destruction would provide you with momentary entertainment. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Now, I could simply expose this evening's events to the media, Dr. Hayes continued. Mr. Vex, I'm sure your competitors would love to run the story about how America's most powerful men conspired to humiliate a child prodigy for sport. The optics alone would be fascinating. Vex's media empire was built on controversy, but being on the wrong side of a story about child abuse would destroy him overnight. Or, Dr. Hayes said, we could discuss a more constructive resolution. Presley leaned forward desperately. What kind of resolution? David will be attending MIT in the fall, Dr. Hayes said. However, he's also been working on a revolutionary algorithm for pattern recognition in large datasets. The applications for financial markets, medical research, and artificial intelligence are considerable. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Several venture capital firms have already offered to fund his startup company. The initial valuation estimates range from $50 million to $200 million, depending on the institutional support he receives. The billionaires exchanged glances. This was language they understood, the language of money and opportunity. What we need, Dr. Hayes continued, is not your charity. We need your respect. We need genuine partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than condescension. Presley's business instincts, dormant since his chess humiliation, suddenly roared back to life. You're talking about an investment opportunity. I'm talking about the chance to be on the ground floor of the next technological revolution, Dr. Hayes corrected. Led by a mind that you just witnessed systematically dismantle one of your peers using nothing but pure intellectual capacity. Senator Richardson cleared his throat. And in return? In return, this evening never happened, Dr. Hayes said simply. David gets to focus on his research instead of dealing with the psychological trauma of being treated like a circus animal. You get access to potentially world-changing technology. Everyone wins. The silence stretched for several long moments as the billionaires processed this new paradigm. They had entered the evening expecting to watch a child's dreams get crushed. Instead, they were being offered the chance to profit from a genuine prodigy's brilliance. How do we know the algorithm actually works? Asked Richardson. David spoke for the first time in several minutes. The pattern recognition system I developed was used to predict the outcome of tonight's chess game with 94.7% accuracy across 2,847 possible variations. He gestured to the demolished position on the marble chessboard. I knew you would play f5 on move 8 because your historical game data showed that you make that mistake 73% of the time when facing the Italian game opening. The entire combination was calculated and verified before you even sat down. The implications were staggering. If David could predict human behavior with that level of accuracy in a complex system like chess, what could he do with financial markets? Political campaigns? Military strategy? Jesus Christ, whispered one of the previously silent billionaires. You're talking about artificial intelligence that can predict human decision-making. Not artificial intelligence, Dr. Hayes corrected. Natural intelligence. The kind that can't be bought, programmed, or replicated. The kind that you almost destroyed tonight for your own amusement. Presley Cummings, his humiliation now competing with his businessman's instincts, made the calculation that would define the rest of his life. What's the minimum investment threshold? Dr. Hayes smiled. 25 million. Each. The number hit the room like a physical blow. $200 million total, and that was just the entry fee for working with a 12-year-old boy they had planned to crush for sport. And if we refuse? Asked Vex. David looked up from the chessboard, his young face showing the same cold intelligence that had dominated the entire evening. Then you'll spend the rest of your lives watching other people profit from my work, he said quietly. And knowing that you had the chance to be part of something extraordinary, but chose cruelty over opportunity. The checkmate, it turned out, had just begun. One by one, the billionaires began to nod their agreement. Not because they had suddenly developed consciences, but because they recognized a paradigm shift when they saw one. The old world, where wealth and connections trumped everything else, was giving way to something new. Something where pure intellectual merit could demand respect and partnership rather than begging for scraps. Presley was the first to speak. I'm in. 25 million. The others followed quickly. In the span of 5 minutes, David Williams, a 12-year-old boy whose father cleaned their offices, had secured $200 million in funding for a company that existed only in his brilliant mind. Excellent, Dr. Hayes said, making notes on her tablet. Legal documents will be prepared by my attorneys. David retains 51% controlling interest in all intellectual property, of course. Of course. The boy who had just systematically destroyed their assumptions about intelligence and worth was now dictating terms to some of the most powerful people on Earth. There is one more thing, David said quietly, and everyone in the room tensed. Yes, Presley asked, fearing another devastating revelation. My father, David said, looking directly at Presley. He deserves better than cleaning your offices. Jerome Williams, who had remained silent throughout the entire proceedings, shifted uncomfortably. David, the job is fine. No, Dad, David interrupted gently. Dr. Hayes is right. We don't need their charity, but you shouldn't have to work 3 jobs anymore. He turned back to Presley. Cummings Tech needs a new vice president of operations. Someone with real experience, real qualifications. Someone who understands what it means to work for everything you have. The suggestion, no. The demand hung in the air. Presley Cummings was being told to hire the janitor as an executive. The irony was so complete it was almost artistic. What are Jerome's qualifications? Presley asked, though he already knew the answer would humble him further. Harvard MBA, 15 years of Wall Street experience, and 8 years of operational knowledge about Cummings Tech's daily functions, Dr. Hayes recited. He's more qualified for the position than the current VP, who got the job because his father plays golf with you. Presley closed his eyes briefly, recognizing another perfect checkmate. Jerome Williams wasn't just qualified for the position, he was overqualified. And everyone in the room now knew it. Starting salary? Presley asked weakly. $180,000 annually, plus stock options and standard executive benefits, David replied without hesitation. Starting salary? Presley asked weakly. $180,000 annually, plus stock options and standard executive benefits, David replied without hesitation. Market rate for someone with his experience and qualifications. Presley nodded numbly. In the span of one evening, he had gone from planning to humiliate a child to hiring that child's father as a senior executive and investing $25 million in the child's company. The reversal was so complete it felt like waking up in an alternate universe. Anything else? Presley asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. David smiled, the first warm, genuine smile anyone had seen from him all evening. Just one thing. I'd like to play you again sometime, when you've had a chance to study. The offer was simultaneously generous and terrifying. David was giving Presley a chance at redemption, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. Presley would never, ever be good enough to pose a real challenge. I'd like that, Presley managed. Dr. Hayes began packing up her tablet. Gentlemen, it's been illuminating. David, say goodbye to our new business partners. David stood and walked around the table, shaking hands with each billionaire in turn. When he reached Presley, he paused. Mr. Cummings, he said quietly, I want you to know that I don't hate you. You're not evil, you're just trapped in a system that taught you the wrong values. Presley felt tears prick his eyes. This child, this extraordinary, brilliant child, was offering him forgiveness he didn't deserve. Thank you, Presley whispered. The real world doesn't work the way you thought it did, David continued. Intelligence matters more than inheritance. Character matters more than connections. And sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimated. He stepped back and rejoined his father and great-grandmother. Dad, David said, you don't have to clean any more offices. Jerome Williams, tears streaming down his face, pulled his son into a fierce hug. I'm so proud of you, he whispered. So incredibly proud. As the three members of the Williams family prepared to leave, Dr. Hayes turned back to the room one final time. Gentlemen, she said, you came here tonight expecting to watch natural selection in action. You were right, you just had the predator and prey reversed. And with that, they walked out, leaving 8 of the world's most powerful men to contemplate the ruins of everything they thought they knew about power, intelligence, and worth. Epilogue, 6 months later. The story of David Williams' chess victory never made the news. The billionaires, true to their agreement, kept the evening's events secret. But the aftermath rippled through their world in ways none of them had anticipated. Cummings Tech's new vice president of operations, Jerome Williams, had revolutionized the company's efficiency within his first month. The man they had dismissed as just a janitor implemented cost-saving measures that increased profits by 23% and improved employee satisfaction ratings to company record highs. David's algorithm, meanwhile, had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The pattern recognition software was being licensed to financial institutions for market prediction, to medical researchers for disease diagnosis, and to tech companies for artificial intelligence development. The 12-year-old's company was now valued at over $400 million. At MIT, David was thriving in ways that surprised even his professors. His youth made him a curiosity, but his intellect made him a force of nature. He was already publishing papers that were reshaping entire fields of study. But perhaps the most significant change was in Presley Cummings himself. The humiliation of that evening had initially devastated him, but gradually, it had become something else: liberation. For the first time in his adult life, he began to question the assumptions that had guided his decisions. He started reading not business books or financial reports, but philosophy, history, literature. He began to see the world through different eyes. And once a week, he met with David for chess lessons. "You're improving," David said during one of their sessions, studying the board with the same intense focus that had demolished Presley months earlier. "You're starting to see patterns instead of just individual moves." Presley smiled. At 53 years old, he was finally learning to think rather than simply react. "Good teacher," he said. "Good student," David replied. "You know what your problem was before? Enlighten me." David moved his knight, a quiet positional improvement that would pay dividends 10 moves later. "You thought chess was about dominating your opponent. But chess isn't about domination, it's about understanding. You have to see the position from both sides, understand what your opponent wants, predict how they'll react to your moves." Presley nodded, studying the new position. "And life?" "Same principle," David said. "You can't make good decisions if you only see the world from one perspective. You have to understand everyone involved, their motivations, their capabilities, their limitations." Presley made his move, a defensive setup that showed he was finally learning patience. "Is that what you did that night?" "Understood us." David was quiet for a long moment. "I understood that you were afraid," he said finally. "All of you. Afraid that maybe the world was changing in ways you couldn't control. Afraid that your advantages weren't as permanent as you thought. Afraid that somewhere out there were people smarter, more capable, more deserving than you." He looked up from the board, his young face serious. "The thing is, those fears were justified. The world is changing. Old advantages don't guarantee future success. And there are brilliant people everywhere, in janitors' closets, in inner-city schools, in places you'd never think to look." Presley felt the truth of it in his bones. "So, what happens to people like me?" David smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "People like you adapt. You learn. You become part of the solution instead of part of the problem." He gestured to the chessboard between them. 6 months ago, I could beat you in 7 minutes. Now it takes me at least 20. You're not the same person who sat down across from me that night." Presley looked at the position, seeing possibilities he never would have noticed before. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." "Your move," David said. "Your move," David said. Presley studied the board, thinking not just about his next move, but about the game within the game, the patterns within patterns, the future possibilities that each decision would create or destroy. For the first time in his life, Presley Cummings was truly learning to play chess. And perhaps more importantly, he was learning to play life. The boy across from him, the son of a janitor who had become his teacher, his partner, and in some strange way, his salvation, watched patiently as Presley contemplated his options. Outside the window, the city hummed with 8 million stories of struggle and triumph, failure and redemption. Somewhere in those streets, other brilliant minds were waiting to be discovered, other underestimated people were preparing to change the world. Presley made his move, not the aggressive attack he would have chosen 6 months ago, but a thoughtful development that showed respect for his opponent's capabilities. Better, David said approvingly. Much better. And in that moment, Presley Cummings understood that losing the most important game of his life had been the first step toward finally learning how to win. The chess pieces sat silent on the board between them, witnesses to a transformation that had begun with checkmate and blossomed into something far more valuable: wisdom. In the end, David Williams had done more than defeat a billionaire at chess. He had taught all of them, that intelligence couldn't be bought, that merit couldn't be manufactured, and that the most powerful move in any game was the willingness to see the world through someone else's eyes. The real lesson wasn't about chess at all. It was about what it meant to be human.